All right, so I'm Chris Borgmeier from Portland State University. Unfortunately, my two colleagues that were listed on the program and supposed to be here weren't able to make it. Kathleen Strickland-Cohen from Texas Christian University, she unfortunately had some health concerns come up, so she wasn't able to be here. And Sheldon Lohman is my colleague at Portland State. So the three of us have worked very closely on this work for the last, it's probably approaching a decade now. But so a lot of credit goes to them in terms of all the work that we've been doing on this project. So progressing through the slides, have you seen these slides at every one of your sessions? Is everybody following the protocol here? Good. So as we're going through the session, consider these 4 questions. Thinking about where are we in our implementation. So what we're going to be talking about today is trying to increase the knowledge of all of our staff in the basics of understanding behavior and function-based intervention. And so I kind of approach that from, a lot of my work is focused on working with students with Tier 3 behavior support needs. However, one of the things we've sort of, there's so much of an emphasis on prevention and early intervention that increasingly these tools that we're using for functional behavioral assessment, we can utilize these with all of our students. And so there's a Tier 3 flavor to this, but in truth, really the work that we're talking about today is going to be more of a Tier 1 intervention. And it's going to be most effective if you're already implementing Tier 1 and you have a strong functioning Tier 1 PBIS team to be able to take some of these tools. You can also embed these with Tier 3 work, in which case you'll also want to take a look at where we're at and what are our needs around Tier 3. But so reflect on briefly just where you are at with your own implementation. And I forgot I got to stay on the side of a line here. So what do you hope to learn as you go through the session? What did you learn? And then probably most importantly is the 4th bullet, thinking about what will I do with what I've learned. We're going to provide you some tools that you can utilize to provide training, but we can use any tools poorly. And so there are free tools that are going to be available to you, but the cost is in thinking about what are the steps you need to take to actually make sure that you're utilizing the tools to get the outcomes that you want. So there's some implementation pieces you really want to be thinking about as you're going through this session. And that's the challenge I give to you, is how can we take these tools and really utilize them to the greatest effectiveness. So the stages of implementation, exploration, and adoption. Today, as we're talking through this, I really want to emphasize, again, that planning, and you're thinking about what are the steps we need to take to really maximize implementation. Where are our staff at? Are we ready to commit to doing this in a way that's going to be most meaningful? Installation, we're providing you tools that should help with your installation of the training materials that we'll be providing. And then initial implementation, we're going to be presenting a way of thinking about behavior that it's going to challenge some folks, and it's going to be different. And as they start, you're going to get some questions. And so again, thinking about how do you support and follow up and follow through to help people through that awkward initial stage of thinking about behavior a little bit differently. And then sticking with some of the homework tasks and exercises that we're gonna present as part of the training to help people support their own learning to get kind of that full implementation. The goal is to really help people gain a fluency so it becomes almost second nature to be thinking about behavior from kind of the lens of function of behavior. All right, and then of course, please provide feedback at the end of the session. And APBS in February, Washington, D.C. And I already talked about the coaching certificate. So I just want to get a brief sense of who's in the room today. So how many of you are classroom general education teachers? Wonderful. How about building administrators? Special educators? School psychologists? School counselors? School social workers? District administrators? Consultants? Anyone from higher education? Because I would love to get these tools into general education teacher prep as well as special education. All right, thank you for letting me know who's here. How many of you are responsible in your buildings for leading the functional behavioral assessment and behavior support planning process? Great, great. You'll definitely have a leadership role in this process. How many of you have participated as a team member on a functional behavioral assessment or behavior support plan? All right. So as I mentioned just briefly, the whole logic behind Schoolwide PBIS is a focus on prevention. This is a 3-tiered prevention model, right? We're trying to figure out what are the steps we can take to try to prevent behavior and put supports in place so that the majority of our students can fall within that Tier 1 realm. However, we, of course, do know we'll have students requiring Tier 2 and Tier 3 support, but we really want to focus on prevention and early intervention. And when we're talking about Tier 3, usually, we're responding to kids who've had some challenges with Tier 1 and Tier 2. And so what I want to do is provide some tools to increase the training of all of our staff to better be able to kind of understand behavior and come up with interventions on their own, which is another layer of support so that they may not need to elevate some of these students to receiving our Tier 2 and our Tier 3 supports. So one of the challenges we have in this work with students with challenging behavior is we oftentimes reserve the most effective tools until students get to a level of need that's pretty severe. So when you think about the triangle logic, you don't hear about functional behavioral assessment unless your students' needs are creeping up into that tip top of the triangle, right? It's actually often, it's in special education law, and what we do is we sort of hold this knowledge and these interventions tight, and only specialists can use these sorts of tools. Well, we want to blow that up. We want to start incorporating this idea and understanding of function of behavior and make it much more available and much more accessible to people from the earliest Tier 1 levels. And then I'm gonna challenge you to think about how can you incorporate some of this work that we're going to be talking about today. How can you also incorporate that into Tier 2 to increase some efficiencies with your Tier 2 interventions? So we're gonna try to make these tools around understanding behavior from a function-based perspective more accessible. And we know that students right now who engage in persistent lower-level behavior experience a lot more reactive disciplinary and more exclusionary discipline. And part of the reason for that is probably we haven't done as good a job as we might of equipping our teachers wide and far with the knowledge and the tools to come up with interventions on their own. And so that's part of the focus here. So this all sort of developed from work with the top part of the triangle and challenges that we've run into in all of my experience working with teams and schools and teachers and students to support those students in the top part of the triangle. One of the things that we've recognized is we need to actually train staff so that we can create some efficiencies in the functional behavioral assessment process. If we come into these meetings talking the same language and thinking about behavioral intervention from a similar lens, we can create some efficiencies because we're always strapped for time with those students at the top part of the triangle who need those red zone supports. So started thinking about school-wide positive behavior support, and you've heard probably a lot the message of Schoolwide PBIS as a framework for increasing efficiency and increasing effectiveness. And we want to just keep moving along in that line of thinking. And so when you think about Tier 1 and improving school climate, you're all probably very familiar with kind of the foundational elements of implementing Schoolwide PBIS. Prevention strategies, we have to define and teach our behavioral expectations and our routines, acknowledging positive behavior, arranging consistent consequences for problem behavior, use of data to inform decision making, having a continuum of intensive supports, administrative leadership, team-based leadership. And so those are kind of the foundational features of Schoolwide PBIS at the Tier 1 level. And we want to continue to build on those and kind of solidify that foundation. So again, having a strong Tier 1 foundation is going to be a really important and critical first step to moving forward with the work that we're going to be talking about here. The one thing I want to add to this list, well, there's maybe 2 or 3 things, but the one thing I'm going to present you today is Could we also add on to this a common understanding of the basics of behavior and behavioral intervention as a universal across all of our staff? So let's think about adding that to our evidence-based features of Schoolwide PBIS. And I know I'm teaching a teacher preparation program for special educators at Portland State University, and I know our students get a great deal of information around understanding behavior and behavioral assessment, behavioral intervention. However, I also know that in our general ed teacher prep program and in our school counselor program, they're not getting that similar information, and they're actually asking for it. A lot of them are coming back to my classes and saying, why didn't I get this when I went through my teacher preparation program? Just these basics of understanding behavior. So we're going to take this logic of establishing a school culture, and we talk about, operating with a common set of values and a common vision across our school. Trying to create a common experience because we're all on the same page in the school, and how that starts with common language. And so common language for supporting students with challenging behavior. Could we start thinking about, could we have a common language in our school that goes further than be safe, be responsible, be respectful, and caught you being good bucks, or these sorts of things? Could we start extending this to understanding behavior from the same lens, talking about triggers of behavior, talking about behavior with kind of an observable definition lens, talking about consequences and possible motivation or function of behavior, and making that common language in the way that we talk with one another around behavior when we're sitting in grade level teams or department teams or teacher assistance teams or whatever they might be. If we're coming at these conversations with more of commonality in the language and the lens that we're using, could we find some benefit there? People understanding what replacement behavior is and setting events. So I want you just to take a couple minutes and turn to a partner and discuss, what do you think are the advantages of having a common language and a common lens or common understanding around the basics of behavior, basics of understanding problem behavior, and function-based intervention? All right, so I'll just run through. I mean, a lot of the things that you mentioned were things that we were thinking about as we were putting this together, and a couple of these that I've already mentioned. But some of the benefits that we see and that I believe we could see from this are, as you've mentioned, staff will have more tools for being able to understand behavior, demystify behavior a little bit. And then they'll have some more tools for identifying interventions on their own and coming up with interventions. So I always tell my students, when I have them do like a functional behavioral assessment, and they have to collect data on a student, and I say, the greatest advantage to you is you're going to learn to do the formal FBA, but what's really going to be beneficial is if you incorporate that knowledge to a point where you're using it on a daily basis in an informal way, where you pause for a second at the end of the week and you say, hey, I saw this student engage in that behavior 6 times this week in math. Are there some patterns there I could pick up to think about how I would intervene differently? It's that informal application of understanding patterns and the triggers to the behavior and the consequences and the function. That's what we want. To me, that's the greatest value, is equipping people with that lens and some tools for just being able to do this kind of on the fly. But to do that, we've got to help get people to a level of fluency. And as you're thinking about how to use these tools, that means you have to think about, we got to move past exposure to fluency, and what is that going to take? How can we do that and support that? Staff can collect data prior to intervention on function of student behavior. As part of the training series, we're actually going to give you some tools, and they're part of the homework that we are going to ask teachers to go back and actually apply these skills. Identify a student with some challenging behavior, and for the next couple of weeks, every time you see this behavior, take a second a little bit later on when you get a chance and jot down what was the trigger, the behavior, the consequence, and we're going to encourage them to start collecting data on a student so they're getting some practice, and now you can be thinking about how could we utilize that data when we start having Tier 2 request for assistance processes, and we can start getting some information for when we do embark on a Tier 3 functional behavioral assessment. Having some of that data in advance is going to be really beneficial for understanding the student. It's going to help the teachers sort of pause for a second and organize their thoughts, and should create some efficiencies with those interviews, as was mentioned by someone here. The other thing is, how many of you have possible motivation on your discipline referral form? If you're using Swiss, you should have possible motivation on there. It's one of the required fields. How many of you have trained your staff on how to use that box? So we'll talk more about kind of some of the findings from the Swiss folks around use of the possible motivation box a little bit later. So the hope is that staff can more effectively complete the discipline referral form, and maybe we can even utilize discipline referral form data more effectively because we're getting more accurate and better information, or more thorough information. We've already talked about kind of increasing the efficiency and the accuracy of FBA interviews with staff. And that increased understanding of the behavioral intervention process. So hopefully, as again you mentioned, we can reduce some of that resistance and increase buy-in and participation if folks have kind of a foundational knowledge of behavioral intervention before we enter into the process. So, big question, why is function so important? So this is just foundational to all of this work, is why is function of behavior so important when we're thinking about understanding behavior and intervention? And this is one of the slides in the training series that I'm going to be showing you. Basically what it says is function is so important because any intervention that we choose can do one of three things. Any intervention, if we're arbitrarily pulling interventions out of a hat or our proverbial toolbox, is any one of those tools depending on what the circumstances are in which we're using it, can make things better, can have no effect whatsoever, or can actually make things worse. And so, think about the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, having an obligation to first do no harm. We want to make sure, and we want to give people the tools to be able to identify, hey, maybe I shouldn't use this tool in this circumstance because it might actually make problem behavior worse. It might escalate behavior. It might increase the likelihood that the student's going to do that behavior again in a similar situation. So I always cringe a little bit when people say, oh, I'm going to expand your toolbox. I'm going to give you some tools. Because without the knowledge and the framework for understanding how to use those tools effectively, you have a 33% chance of using those tools for bad and not for good. And so we gotta give folks the tools around understanding function of behavior. So one of the most simple examples is timeout, right? Elementary intervention, very common use of timeout. And so the student engages in a problem behavior, we say, well, send them to timeout, right? But what's the problem with timeout? They might want it. And if they want timeout, and you give them timeout for engaging in the problem behavior, those students are in math, and I come around and give them the math worksheet, and the student, starts to well up and get a little frustrated because they don't like the math worksheet, and they throw a little fit, and they tear it up and throw it on the ground and curse it at me. And then I say, you need to go sit in the hallway right now. Or you need to go sit in the back of the room and think about what you just did. And that student's doing what? Cha-ching, score. Hey, that worked out pretty well for me. So tomorrow I come around and give them the math worksheet, and what runs by that student's mind? You know what I tried yesterday? Maybe I'll try that even bigger, badder, meaner, and faster today. And we get in that cycle where we're solidifying. So we've got to be careful about identifying interventions that are going to make it worse. And again, timeout can be a wonderful intervention, but it requires that there's a time in. There's something the student wants to be a part of. And so if the function of a student's behavior is they want to get attention from an adult, or the function is they want to get to read in their reading group aloud. If I then say, you're engaging in problem behavior, you're gonna have to miss this reading opportunity, and they really want to be a part of that, that's timeout from the opportunity to read, and the student sitting there saying, wow, I really wanted to read. I'm not going to do that again because I don't want to miss another turn. Or recess. If I had to sit on the bench, recess was my life. I think my son has inherited that trait. because that's the first thing I hear about every day when he comes home from school. But if I had to sit on that bench for 30 seconds out of a 15-minute recess and watch my peers playing and having fun, that felt like an eternity. And whatever I did right before that, I wasn't going to do that again, because that was a meaningful consequence to me. So we've got to understand how function is integral to understanding when and which behaviors to use, and start using that framework, especially if we've given folks a large toolbox and they can start to understand which tools to use under which circumstances. So there's all kinds of research studies done on this. Kevin Filter from Minnesota State University Mankato did this study. And basically the idea here is, a school team comes up with an intervention, kind of business as usual. The stuff you hear about, in my session yesterday, someone said, we do FBAs and all our interventions look the same. And it's one of those interventions. That's the same intervention for all of our kids under the guise of being function-based. And that's what this intervention is here right after baseline is. It's one of those interventions, kind of business as usual. And what we see is problem behavior stays about the same, and academic engagement stays about the same as baseline. When we actually go in and we put a function-based intervention in place that's based on the function of the behavior the student's engaging in, we see immediately problem behavior goes almost down to 0 and task engagement goes up to almost 100%. We remove the function-based intervention and we're back to the original levels. There are many studies like this. Kimberly Ingram did this study back in 2005, and you can just see function-based, non-function-based, function-based, non-function-based. So problem behavior is very responsive to whether or not we're using function-based interventions versus some of the business as usual. So there's all kinds of research on this. I'm not going to go on and on about that, but I can if you want me to. All right, so this is the famed triangle, right? But what's wrong with this triangle? The yellow's too big. I'd argue the red's too big. The green's too small, right? And one of the ideas here is we implement strong Tier 1 supports so that we have a positive, predictable environment that the majority of our students can thrive in. And when we do that, and I didn't do this effect, but I'm always open to you oohing and aahing in admiration of the fancy graphics that I'm going to show you right now. So feel free to ooh and ah. But the idea is we're completely overwhelmed in this school, right? Implementing Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports is going to scratch the surface. A lot of the plans aren't going to sustain. They're not going to be effective. We got to have that strong Tier 1 in place. And here's where I can cue the oohing and aahing. Watch this. We implement a strong Tier 1 program and... Yeah.
Did you do that again?
I will. Only if you promise to ooh and ah again. Yes, I could do that all day. That just warms my heart. So this is what we're striving for, right? But maybe if we even layer on a little extra, hey, let's understand basics of behavior and function-based intervention, maybe we can even nudge this up a little bit higher where some of the teachers now have more skills to be able to deal with some of those challenging students on their own, so we're not writing that extra referral or making that request for assistance to those teams. Because, whenever we're getting into Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, schools are always tested because of the limited resources that we have. So again, the more we can do to be prevention-oriented and bring some of this knowledge that we've been preserving only for our students who need Tier 3 supports, let's start bringing that in and making it more common language. So I'm going to introduce you now to the training series. So Basic FBA to BIP is a training series we developed initially to train building level behavior specialists in what we call Basic FBA. Again, trying to make this more accessible for implementation across our schools because it is this strong research-based intervention. And so if you go to basicfba.com, this is a free website. And we put a lot of work into it, so we are hopeful that folks are going to use it. And if you have suggestions and feedback, please let us know. We'd be happy to hear about those. So this is the front page. At the very bottom, you see these two buttons, the Behavior Specialist Training and the Schoolwide Training. So the behavior specialist training is a series of 7 modules that we would encourage like schools to think about having a team of like your behavior specialist team that you would train to have local capacity to be able to support students. They're going to get the more in-depth knowledge about how to do that functional behavioral assessment and how to lead behavior support planning processes and how to support staff with implementation of those plans. So there's 7 modules for that one. The school-wide training down here at the bottom on the right is just 2 modules, and those are the 2 modules we picked from the other training that we encourage all staff to get so we can start establishing that common understanding of behavior. So I worked with Kansas TASN on this. The TASN, the Technical Assistance Systems Network in Kansas, they have a large, Kansas is a pretty rural state, and they've invested a lot in e-learning so that they can reach out to the state. And they saw our training materials and they said, hey, we'd like to help you take the next step with these. And so Eddie and Tyler were the two web developers, instructional designers that I worked with. Eddie carried the most of the load, but I always want to give credit to them and to TASN for these e-learning modules wouldn't have happened without them. And we spent a lot of time on the phone, or not on the phone, but on like Google Chat over the course of a year, back and forth while they're working away in Kansas, and I'm trying to keep ahead of them to keep them busy. So great guys and fun to work with them. So the online module features. Each module has a pre-test and a post-test. There's a participant guide that we encourage users to print out. It's got some of the slides, and some of the modules have activities that they would use with the participant guide to fill those out. Every module also has, you can print out a copy of the slides, and there's even the scripts for any slides that have voiceover. There's the scripts. You can have the script there of what was said for the slides. There's a lot of interactive activities built in. So we actually encourage that every participant is sitting at a computer and actually doing it. Don't share multiple people looking at one computer, because there's so much interactivity that it's going to be less probably engaging if I'm not navigating the interactions myself. There's some video embedded in, and we build in some practice opportunities to like do observations and apply some of the skills through video activities within the modules. All the forms and resources are available, and there's even a way to have yourself reminded to do the homework tasks a couple times over the course of a week after you do the training. And maybe best of all, these are free. So I'm going to show you a quick video here. This is just going to give you a flavor of what the modules look like and some of the features and the interactions. The first bit of this is from the Moodle site. So these are also available through Kansas. They have a Moodle site. And then they're also accessible through basicfba.com. So I will show you this video just so you can get a little flavor of the modules. So this is the Moodle interface with the background there. So if you go to basicfba.com, you don't see this. One of the things I didn't like as much about Moodle is you can't make this screen bigger easily, and because it embeds it within the Moodle background. You can see some of the interactions here. Got some comics. Got to choose the right consequence. Drag and drop. Lots of feedback. This content's actually from Module 6, so it's not one of the modules that you would use for the training, but we just want to give you an overview of what the slides feel like and the activities. so just a quick flavor there of what the modules look like. All right, so this is all 7 modules, and the ones with the red boxes there, Module 1 and Module 4, are the 2 that we use for the school-wide training for all staff. And so Module 2 and Module 3, you get into how to conduct a functional behavioral assessment interview for our specialists. And then Module 5, 6, and 7 are about identifying function-based interventions, how to support implementation of the plan, and then measurement and evaluation, but you don't have to worry about those ones. So if you go to the website, along the top, this black bar is a lot of information there about how to best utilize the modules. And so if you go to Planning for Effective Use, there's a drop-down menu and there's a School-Wide Plan button there. So if you're planning to do this with your whole staff, there's some guidance on this page here. And so basically what this says is each of the modules, well, the module is going to take, Module 1, depending on how fluent people are with sort of interacting with e-learning modules, it might be closer to 45 minutes, but to be safe, probably thinking about 60 minutes to get through Module 1. Module 4 maybe is a little bit longer, 75 minutes or so. So you want to direct staff to the website, basicfba.com. They can click on the Schoolwide Training button on the right side there. And after they progress through the module, at the very end, there's a results page that looks like this. And it has the name on it and the post-test score. And so I do this with my students, and they just take a screenshot of this, and then they'll email it to me as sort of evidence of completion. So I'd encourage you to think about how you're going to get sort of that evidence of completion of your staff members. And then there's links, buttons to all the forms that were used in that module. Again, this is Module 6. And then the homework piece. And so probably from my estimation, the most important thing is you follow up the lesson with application activities where people are actually applying this with a real student that they're struggling with behaviorally. And so support staff with completing the homework task, create opportunities for staff to then review and discuss. So in this example, for Module 1, they'll identify a student they've been struggling with, and they're going to collect ABC sequences of the student's trigger of behavior, the behavior, and then what happened following the behavior. And for a week or two, they will collect data, and then they're going to form a summary of behavior down here at the bottom. And that is kind of their understanding of what's going on with this student. So again, it's just a chance to sort of slow down and try to look with maybe a little more objective lens than we have maybe when we're caught up in the moment and trying to understand what's going on with the student. And so find opportunities for grade level teams to say, hey, how's that data collection going? Can we take a look at what you got? And maybe they can start even having some discussion around, hey, what could I do with this information? What could I do with this data? Are there things that are coming to mind in terms of intervention? And doing some problem solving there, but doing it from a common framework that has a little bit more focus on a connection to intervention than maybe we traditionally see in some of those contexts. So then going on to Module 4, and Module 4, they'll actually take the data they collected on the student, and they'll take the next step of starting to try to document and generate some intervention ideas for that they could utilize with their own student in their own classroom. And they're coming up with the ideas, or you may be coming up with ideas. And so they're always better ideas if you come up with them than if I come up with them. So I'm going to give you kind of just a quick overview of the content in the modules. So Module 1 is defining and understanding behavior. This is really the basics. We start with an observable definition of behavior. And so we try to move away from comments like aggressive behavior or defiant or disruptive, because what's the problem with disruptive? It's not specific. Your understanding of disruptive could be very different than my understanding of disruptive. And so we want to start with a observable, measurable definition. So we start with just having some practice around getting more observable and more measurable about the behavior. Then we get into what are the triggers. So we first look at what's the overall routine. This happens more often in reading, or this happens more often during lunchtime. And so we try to start localizing the behavior so we can understand it according to the routine of the behavior. And this is a shift for a lot of folks. A lot of times when we talk about behavior, we talk about the behavior and we organize around the behavior. This kid hit, kicks, and spits. But the challenge, if we just talk about hitting, kicking, and spitting, is the student hits, kicks, and spits in math class, and the student hits, kicks, and spits at recess. And we start having conversations or thinking about this, and we bundle all that together. And the problem is, the student hit, kicks, and spits for a very different reason in math than they do at recess. And when we bundle these together, we lose that sort of nuance. We actually do better organizing behavior by routine than we do by behavior. And so this is a little bit of retraining for a lot of people, is how do I think about, okay, they hit, kick, and spit, but if I think about that, all day long, it's really overwhelming for me to think about that. If I think about why do they do that during math, now it's easier for me to sort of localize and understand why they're engaging in those behaviors. And so we talk about identifying the where or the routine of the behavior and organizing around routine. And we go into much more depth, so I can't do this justice right now. And then we get into the triggers. What is it immediately that's triggering the behavior right before it, and what patterns can we see there? Then we get into what's the consequence? What happens after the student engages in the behavior, and understanding how do we turn that information into a summary statement that helps us understand the function of behavior. So we start with just some of those common frustrations about understanding student behavior, where we end up talking to the principal or our coach and throwing our hands up in the air, and we don't necessarily have a framework for understanding behavior to help move this conversation along. So antecedent behavior consequence or trigger behavior consequence. So we basically use this mantra: when this happens, the student does this behavior, and as a result, this happens. Therefore, the function of the behavior is to get this or to avoid this. And so we're trying to get people on the same page in terms of thinking about and organizing behavior according to trigger, behavior, consequence. And this is a great starting point, because within that sequence, those are things that are occurring in the environment that we're working with the student. So they're tangible things that we can do. So we also talk about setting events, which are things that happen outside of the environment. And it's good to know about and understand those. And sometimes we can do some things to support setting events in a more effective way, and sometimes we have a more difficult time doing that. So we want folks to understand that, but we're going to start with the basics of trigger, behavior, consequence. So like I mentioned, observing definitions of behavior that are observable and measurable. We've got some activities here where you have to identify yes or no. Is getting out of desk and hitting another student observable and measurable? Yes or no? And then you get feedback. You can see the feedback's already revealed in this slide. An example of defining behavior. And then there's a video activity where you actually watch a student and you form a definition of behavior based on the framework that we provide. Then we get into the antecedents. And so we break it down, and it's really broken down and really explicit. So we'll talk about antecedents. You'll have some activities around identifying the triggers. And here this is talking about the importance of routines and the idea that behavior is contextual. And so thinking about your own behavior. Your behavior probably differs if you are out last night wandering the bars between conference nights and sitting in a conference session this morning with 50 other people. Your behavior is very much dependent on context, as are our students' behaviors. And so we always want to understand behavior within context. And so use routine as the operating organizer for understanding behavior. So here's just some drag and drop, starting to use this with scenarios. We've got some more comics here. looking at consequence, so putting all the pieces together, trigger, behavior, consequence. So these are each sections, and then what does that tell us about function of behavior? And some of the most common functions of behavior that we see in schools: to get peer attention, to get adult attention, or to avoid difficult tasks, easy tasks, boring tasks. So these are just a snapshot of some of the content. You can go home tonight, pop some popcorn, and run through Module 1. So putting it all together in a summary statement, and now you've got to kind of surmise what's the function of behavior based on the information that I know here. And so we're really just trying to get people practicing and fluent with this lens, this framework for understanding behavior. Now we're talking about setting events and, lack of sleep, didn't eat breakfast, all these different potential setting events that are out there, and helping people to understand setting events. And so the thing that kind of underlies behavior is we've got to be really careful about taking any one occurrence of behavior and making too much of it. So the idea here is we're looking for patterns of behavior. And that's where now we start looking at some patterns of students' behavior. And so as we look across the 3 incidents here, can we see some commonality across the triggers that we can learn about what is triggering Brenda's behavior? And so we have folks kind of go through and look at 4 or 5 incidents and then identify what's your overall summary of behavior. Because we've got to be careful about jumping to big conclusions based on one occurrence of a behavior. But when we start seeing 4, 5, 6 incidents with common triggers and common consequences, now we've got some good direction for moving forward with intervention planning. So, and that kind of leads us into the homework task. So we ask people to identify, hey, what's your tough time of day? If I'm an elementary teacher, the student has a tough time during morning play. Well, let's collect data during morning play and organize by morning play to try to understand what's going on. And then over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to collect data on every time Brenda engages in problem behavior. What was the trigger that just occurred? What was the consequence? And I'm going to jot that down. And after we collect 5 or 6 incidents, I'll form my own summary statement looking for trends. And so now we're applying this with students in our classrooms, which I think is where you really solidify the knowledge. And that's where, if you're planning to use this with your staff, I think that's the most critical piece, is how are you going to follow up and encourage and acknowledge people who take the step to do this in their classroom with their own student, with a student of their choosing. So there's also some nice writings that we've done. So there was an article in Beyond Behavior about the ABC tracker, which is basically this tool. And so I think the article does a nice job of giving some examples and kind of painting a picture. So that might be another tool you could use with these modules if you track down that Beyond Behavior article. And then the other piece is this office referral form. So possible motivation. I didn't see too many people raising their hand and saying, yeah, we've trained people on possible motivation. How many of you have concerns about the information you're getting from possible motivation box? Yeah, a couple. So we make a clear connection between this is what learning about function of behavior has to do with that filling out that possible motivation box on your discipline referral form. So if you don't have that on your referral form, maybe now you get some more meaningful information from it. PBIS apps and PBIS assessment did a really nice article on possible motivation, and they kind of walked through our training tools a little bit here. So that's another really great resource that's really readable and really user-friendly. Megan Cave, I think, was the lead author on that and did a really remarkable job with that. She caught me at a conference last spring in Washington, and she told me this about how they've been looking at their possible motivation data. So she summarizes this in the article. She says, basically, we've got 5.3 million office discipline referrals in Swiss. Almost 1/3 of them list unknown as the perceived motivation. We're missing data from 1.7 million of those referrals because people don't know what to do with that box. So just think about, we might be able to create a lot more efficiencies around intervention if people are utilizing possible motivation more effectively, and we trust the information we're getting from possible motivation more effectively. So we have another video activity where people watch this vignette, and then they actually kind of fill out a mock office discipline referral form here based on what they're seeing and the data they're collecting. We give them a little feedback on that. So we also have folks then, so pretend this is your printout for a student who got these 5 office discipline referrals, and now we start thinking about using a function of behavior in a very preliminary sort of way to inform our intervention planning. So now if I have a tier 2 team or even a grade level team that's talking about a student, and we pull up their discipline referral forms and we see some patterns in the possible motivation, we see avoid task, avoid peer, avoid task, avoid task. So whenever we're in the classroom, we're starting to see a lot of avoiding task, and that starts to give us a jumping off point for maybe collecting some more information about what we can do to support this student. And so now we're starting to use functional behavioral assessment in a very preliminary way and function of behavior to start informing interventions at a much earlier level, which can be pretty helpful in helping us to identify more effective interventions. So we got an activity where then you would do that using this data set, and that leads us to the homework task that the teachers will do. Filling out their ABC tracker. So then their summary behavior that they come up with for their own student, like I mentioned, that leads us into Module 4. And at the end of Module 4, they should have started to complete their own intervention ideas for the student in their classroom that hopefully they can go and then try to intervene. And hopefully we set this up where there's a kind of an iterative expectation that you're going to come back and talk to your grade level colleagues about how that intervention's going and what's working and what you learned in this process, and thinking about a way to keep this conversation going and keep some of these efforts going to really solidify that learning around function of behavior. So like I mentioned, we encourage the leadership to think about, are there ways you can incorporate ABC and function of behavior into your Tier 2 teaming process, as well as supporting your teachers to really use this? So we might make this a part of our request for assistance process. Maybe you have to complete an ABC tracker and attach it to a request for assistance so we know that you've went through, and maybe even have to attach the interventions that you had generated and implemented from that as sort of a first step to showing that you've demonstrated you've looked closely at this yourself, and that's giving us information that can really equate and lead right into informing some of the interventions from a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 level, again, creating some of those efficiencies that are so central to PBIS. So the modules, this is just evaluation data, and so I got this a couple weeks ago. This is just Module 1, and we had 147 respondents. And so you can see the scale here is strongly agree and agree. So blue is strongly agree, orange is agree, gray is disagree, and yellow is strongly disagree. And we're at like 98%, 95%. We're above 95% on all of these. Was this an effective use of your time to complete Module 1? Were you able to functionally transfer your learning into practice for Module 1? Will you use this content or implement this content, and did you find it of high quality? And so our initial user data, which I was nervous to look at, is resoundingly positive. So, and it's actually very similar across all 7 modules that we've looked at. So, so it seems like folks are finding the modules pretty effective. All right, Module 4 takes us into, now you've got some data, now what do we do with it? And that function-based intervention piece. So there's a couple other readings that are pretty, they're pretty practitioner-friendly oriented. They're not research articles, but we do have some research articles too. This is actually research and practice in the schools. This is free online. You can go in just to this link and download this article, or Google research and practice in the schools, and look for Volume 2, Issue 1. But this critical features for identifying function-based supports, it's really, we apply the logic of Module 4 and walk through some cases, and it's really intended for teachers to be able to use as an example. So it's a nice maybe add-on to the modules. And then this is a research study that we conducted. Several years ago, I would actually do Module 4 in a live presentation, and we do it at workshop sessions like this. I don't think I ever did it at the forum, but I did it at APBS a couple times, where you would, and it was kind of funny for folks, you'd walk into the session and you'd get a pretest. So you'd pick up a pretest as you walk through the door, and you'd have to do the pretest during the first 7 to 10 minutes of the session, and then I'd collect those from you. And then we'd deliver the content, and then you'd do a post-test the last 7 minutes of the session, and we collect those. And by doing these sessions, we collected data, and we saw we were able to increase your ability to identify function-based interventions from about 45% accuracy to about 85% accuracy. And that was kind of across a lot of different roles that people play in schools. So we were able to do that, and actually Kathleen Strickland-Cohen did another study in which she followed up with people who got this training a year later, and their scores maintained at 85% on that same post-test assessment, and so that was promising. So there's some research behind Module 4. Module 4, the content in there, although it's an e-learning format now, it's a research-based module. So the focus here is really on how do we make direct connections from what we learned in our assessment to inform identification of our interventions. And so we teach teaching, prevention strategies, and prompting strategies to prompt the behaviors that we want to see, reinforcing behaviors, reinforcing the replacement behavior and the desired behavior. So in this module, people are going to get familiar with that terminology of replacement behavior and desired behavior. And then, what do we do to respond to problem behavior, redirecting problem behavior, and making sure that we're not identifying interventions that are those interventions that actually might make problem behavior worse. So we want to be very careful about that. So we just start with, the reason you do this this assessment to identify the function of behavior and the triggers, behavior, and consequences is so that you can actually use it to inform intervention plan. It's not just an exercise in data collection. It's an exercise we want to be turning into tangible changes in our classroom. So we use function of behavior to inform our interventions when we're thinking about how do we change or modify the triggers to the behavior, or what are we going to teach, or how do we change our reinforcement and our redirection strategies. So we teach competing behavior pathway framework, and so we spend some time really breaking that down and help people understand that. And the whole idea there is it's a great organizational structure for looking at behavior and transitioning from assessment to intervention. And then down below here are the specific strategies for prevention, teaching, and rewarding behavior and redirecting behavior. And so we go step by step, and we teach and give examples of how to do these interventions. And then again, on the e-learning modules, you'll have a pre-test and a post-test, very similar, where you get to demonstrate your knowledge growth. So desired behavior, of course, is the ultimate goal, right? This is what you want students to do. You want students engaging in the positive behaviors that are going to keep them instructionally engaged. They're looking like the other students. You'd expect the other students to look in the classroom. And so we start because that's what everybody wants, right? They want to go from students engaging in rampant problem behavior today to voila, perfect, desired behavior. 10 out of 10 times, right? And I mean, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of times I'll walk into situations and like if we're not, I mean, oftentimes these are folks who are rightfully at the end of their rope because they've been struggling with the student without support for long periods of time. And and you talk about ACEs and trauma in the classroom and some of the residual trauma that we experience as practitioners in this field. I mean, it's understanding why our hope is for this, and we probably even know it's not a realistic hope, but we kind of walk through and help people understand how we think about that and what that has to do with the replacement behavior. So we'd lay out the antecedent, the trigger, the behavior, the consequence that we got from our ABC in this middle row, and then we've got to fill in these other 3 boxes here. And so here's where we get to the replacement behavior logic. And so the module, we do, I think we do this pretty well. But the whole idea here is just that. For a lot of our kids, we aren't going to be able to jump from problem behavior straight to desired behavior, because there's skill deficits and skill gaps that prevent that from happening. Like if you can't do this math worksheet tomorrow and you're engaging in problem behavior because you can't do the math worksheet, it's frustrating and you feel like a failure, or you don't want to embarrass yourself in front of your peers. It's not like I can tomorrow give you that same math worksheet and expect that we're not going to have any problems, because we need to build the math skills to close that gap, and that oftentimes takes time depending on what the prerequisite skills are that you need. Or if it's attention-seeking behavior and a student has learned, if I'm super obnoxious, that's the best way to get the adults to dance and to give me the attention that I need. It's going to take some time to build the social skills to move up to that desired behavior so that the students are looking like the other students. The other thing is, right now, the student is engaging in problem behavior whenever I give them that math task. They're engaging in problem behavior, and they rip it up and they get sent to the office, and they don't have to do that math task. And so we're going from, hey, I'm engaging in that problem and I don't have to do the math problem. What a deal, right? To thinking that tomorrow I'll give you the same math task and the student's gonna take their hand out and smile and say, thank you, I can't wait to get started with this math worksheet. Let me grab that, put my name on it, and get started. And what happens for most students once they finish that first math problem? What's the big reward for those students? They get to go on to the next problem, right? So we're going from no way, no how, I ain't doing none of it, to yes, please, can I do the next problem? And that's an enormous jump for a lot of our students, and and I mean, it's obvious, right? But we've got to help keep that in mind as we're thinking about this, and particularly why the replacement behavior is so important. So, what the common arguments against replacement behavior? Does anybody want to shout out the common? For those of you who do behavior support planning.
It's too incremental for the teacher.
Okay, it's too incremental. We're rewarding negative behavior. We're giving the student what they want, and that does not feel right, because I'm frustrated with this kid, and the last thing I want to do is let the student have their way, right? And that's probably the most common thing, and again, it's understandable given the circumstances that we've been through. But the thing is, right now, the student is still getting their way, but they're getting their way at the expense of everyone else's instruction, maybe their safety. And so the replacement behavior is giving them what they want, but that's because the only way we're going to convince them to give up the hitting, kicking, spitting is if they can get what their needs met without using those behaviors. And so we need to unteach and then reteach a replacement to get what they want if we're going to support them to move away from the problem behavior. And so that teaching becomes, so we go into a pretty good depth with that in the modules, but it's a tough thing to understand, and we face a lot of resistance oftentimes to replacement behavior, this idea of replacement behavior, even though as teachers, we should actually have a pretty easy time understanding why the replacement behavior is so important. But that's easier said than done, right? So it's another effort to try to help us understand that. So this is the example of the slide where we go through it. We resort to smiley emojis and frowny emojis, and so it's kind of fun. But the whole idea of the replacement behavior is it's an immediate attempt to reduce disruption and reduce potentially problem behavior. We want to see it as it's like we're trying to take the pressure off the teacher. It's like a pressure valve. Can we reduce the pressure on the teacher by immediately trying to reduce those more significant problem behaviors that are so taxing? So then we go through and we start talking about the interventions, and so identifying a replacement behavior, the prevention strategies, reinforcement, redirect, minimize. And so for our triggers, we give some examples of how would you eliminate this trigger, or a lot of times you can't eliminate the trigger. All you can do is modify the trigger to the student's behavior. Like, how many of you are happy saying, well, if the student doesn't want to do the math problem, let's just not ever have them do math problems, and then we won't see the problem behavior. Like, that's not, no, we can't do that. It would reduce problem behavior, but it's not a long-term reasonable goal. So now we need to focus on modifying the trigger. How could we modify the assignment maybe in the short term until we're able to teach the skills the student needs and start, getting them, hopefully closing that gap and getting them closer and closer to the work that all the other students are doing. So reinforcement strategies, we talk about reinforcement and the dangers, the pitfalls that we oftentimes get into with reinforcement is it's the Disneyland version of reinforcement. If you're good from now until the end of the year, we'll take you to Disneyland. And we know it's a very safe investment because there's not a chance the student's going to get through the next hour. And they don't see, if you're talking about some of these students, they don't see behavior as a 6-month endeavor. They see it as like a 60-second endeavor. And so we talk about some of the most common misrules with how people use reinforcement and thinking about how to utilize reinforcement strategies more effectively, the need to reinforce the replacement behavior and nudge people to motivate them to engage in the desired behavior over time, and then minimizing and breaking habits and responding to problem behavior. This is one of my favorite slides here. I grew up watching The Incredible Hulk on Friday nights, and so do you want to redirect Bruce Banner, or do you want to redirect the Hulk? And so we talk about understanding the need to redirect early and often, and redirecting to that replacement behavior and why that's so important. So that's your homework task then, is to utilize this training to try to generate some strategies that you could then implement back in your classroom with the student that you've identified. So using that ABC tracker result to develop your intervention ideas, and then hopefully we put in place an iterative process where you're able to kind of come back and share, or like I said, maybe this becomes part of the request for assistance process where we can see what's the ABC information and so on. So the goals here: create a common language for approaching student problem behavior across the school, increase your teachers' capacity to understand and clearly communicate student behavior, increase our teachers' and staff's capacity to generate effective function-based interventions, incorporate data about function more effectively into Tier 2 intervention planning, maybe through the ABC tracker information or better use, more effective use of the possible motivation, and increase the effectiveness and efficiency with which teachers and staff can participate in the formal FBA BIP process. So I want to take you back to this last question: what will I do with what I learned? So I want to give you a couple minutes to maybe pair and share with a partner and say, if or how could we use this, and what are some strategies you would use to try to maximize use of these learning modules? So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk about that. So seeing some value in the idea of using this as part of the kind of the request for assistance, because too often people want to jump from I want the student moved to a different placement, and we don't have evidence that the steps have been taken in the interim, and so this can help fill that. All right, so well, thanks for sharing. Again, the behavior specialist modules are also out there. They're also available for free if you want to identify a small team within your school to build capacity to actually go forth and do the Tier 3 practices. And take a look through we tried to put as many resources on here as we could to help people utilize the modules most effectively. So check out the black bar at the top here. And I'll just show you one more thing so you can get a look at what the page looks like. If I'm on the front page and I click on Schoolwide Training, so this, it's good to read these tips because there are a few tips you want to know before you get frustrated. One of the main things is, well, print out the participant guide. If you get stuck on a slide, this is technology, right? The best strategy is to move the timeline back and play it through to the end again, because we get in trouble a little bit when we try to jump ahead. And we oftentimes do in e-learning modules, if we can jump ahead, we try to jump ahead, and we miss an interaction in there. And so the best thing to do is always tell people to go back, pull it back, and follow through to the end to make sure you didn't miss an interaction there. So encourage your users to use that. And then you got an example here of the results page that they can see, or you can show them so they know what they're looking for if you want to have them print out that page or do a print screen and send it to you. But to open Module 1, all you do is go here and click on this button, and it'll take you right there. These are all the forms that you need, so you can always go back to this page. The participant guide is there to print out, the module slides and the audio scripts, and then the homework form, the ABC tracker, is all right here. So all the forms that you need and the button to start the training, it's all laid out for you. So you just click the button, and you also want to have a good internet connection. So
Hi there. Welcome to Basic FBA
this is my
to
wife's
BIP,
voice. She helped me with
series
the
of
voiceover.
trainings
So.
on how to conduct functional behavior
So that's kind of a
assessments
sampling
to
of
inform behavior
just how to
intervention
access it.
plans.
So try to make it pretty easy to access for folks. So thank you all and good luck.